Hello and welcome back to yet another purpose session. This session is called Foundation because the church is built on a steady foundation, and we're going to be talking a little bit about what that foundation looks like. First of all, I got to ask you, have you ever been on a tour where you've had a tour guide leading you through this place to point out everything that you're seeing? I remember the first time I had arrived in Rome and somebody led us on a tour through St. Peter's Basilica, and it was about a 2-hour long tour. And I remember just being floored by all the things this tour guide could point out that I didn't realize even existed, or I didn't understand what it all meant. And it was amazing how much I learned just by having that person there to point out everything that was standing before me, looking me in the face, but that I still couldn't receive or couldn't understand on my own. And in some ways, that's the role of the church. The church stands there as a tour guide, and it has for the past 2,000 years to point out to people like you and me what's going on, how God is trying to break into our lives. This is why the church is called a sacrament in a way. It's one of the sort of sacraments in the sense that it's pointing us to God. That's what the sacraments do. You'll remember, this is the definition that you need to memorize. A sacrament is an efficacious sign of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the church, by which divine life is dispensed to us through the work of the Holy Spirit. An efficacious sign of grace instituted by Christ and entrusted to the church that gives us divine life. And in some ways, we have our 7 sacraments, but the church acts as a sacrament in the firm foundation that constantly she is there. Yes, she, because she gives birth to us in baptism. She is there to point the way for us to Jesus, back home to God. It's a living body, this church, and it's part of Jesus' mission. In the Gospels, Jesus asks Peter, "Who do people say that I am?" And Peter responds, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." What great faith Peter had. You are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus looks at him and says, "You are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church." And it's funny how that works, because he says to Peter, Peter in Greek means rock. So Jesus, actually, the first time that name Peter is ever used, Jesus makes it up for Peter. Nobody was ever called rock before. Nobody was ever called Peter until Peter was called Peter. And upon this rock, I will build my church. This church was to be built upon Peter. That Peter had some sort of role in this whole plan. That Peter was the one that was the firm foundation that Jesus wanted to build his church, his ecclesia in Greek, which means to be called out. In the church, we are called out of the world to be with God. We're a people chosen by God, and it's our job to call people into that life. And Peter, of course, is given the keys to the kingdom of heaven, those keys which unlock the treasures of heaven, unlock this kingdom. It gives him credibility that from Peter all the way down to all the popes, to all the way to St. Francis, or to Pope Francis, there's a line that they're credible because we have a line of witnesses who have been lifting up and witnessing the church for 2,000 years. And because Peter has the keys, he also has the authority. He's the one who can bind and loose. He's the one who has authority over the church to govern, to make rules, so that we can stay on the straight and narrow path like a tour guide. If I'm on a tour, I don't get to create the path. The tour guide has done this before. They've been here before. They know what we should see first, what we should avoid. And we're going to follow that tour guide all the way. But Jesus left, right? He died, he rose from the dead, and he ascended into heaven. But he promised his church, he said, "I will not leave you orphans." Because we had become so close to Jesus. He was this sort of fatherly figure. People relied on him. And Jesus says, "I'm not going to leave you orphans. I'm going to send my Holy Spirit to be with you and to guide you into all truth. And he breathed his Holy Spirit on the apostles at Pentecost, sent his Holy Spirit down at Pentecost, and it was on that day that the church was really born, that it began to flourish with all of the gifts of God. And why did he have to send the Holy Spirit? Because he knew we were human. He knew that we were weak. He knew that we weren't perfect and that we would need his Spirit to lead us into all truth, to stay on this tour, to be with him, the tour guide, and to allow us to see everything he wanted us to see in this life. The Lord is leading us. I just covered a lot of ground, so I want to recap. Here are the essential points. Jesus established a church. He gave that church authority. He entrusted Peter to oversee the church. And Jesus promised to never leave the church. And in his absence, and because we are not perfect, he sent the Holy Spirit to guide the church and remind the church of everything that he taught, which is our launching off point. He wanted the church to be passed down through the ages. So at the very end of his life, before he ascends into heaven, Jesus tells his apostles, "Go forth and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I have commanded you." Jesus gives his disciples, his apostles, a missionary mandate. Go forth and make disciples. You are called to be a disciple. And you then are called to go and make disciples as the apostles did as well. Jesus left a church so that for 2,000 years after his death, after his resurrection, after his ascension, so that you and I could be led into the truth, so that you and I could know God. This is why Jesus gave us the church. And this is why for 2,000 years, people have been following Jesus. If he didn't leave a church, how would we know him? So we need to trust the church. And in the most tangible way that the church is a mother for us, teaches us, is through the sacraments. That these are real ways that we communicate with God, that he gives us, in truth, his divine life. Truly he does. He gives us his very life, strength and courage and patience and perseverance, and the grace to love more fully, more faithfully, more steadfastly. That's why it's so important for you and I to participate in the sacraments, especially the Eucharist and reconciliation. And if you haven't been to reconciliation in a long time, this is a great opportunity to go to reconciliation. We have so many times available at St. Clair, and I'd be happy to hear yours. But Jesus wants to draw near. But in some ways, in this time, we need to go back to Peter's confession. Who is Jesus for you? I remember the first time I ever heard Pope Francis speak, I remember him asking that question to us in Italian. Chi è Gesù per me? Who is Jesus for me? Can you answer that question? Is he the Christ, the Son of the living God? C.S. Lewis has this epic line about who Jesus is. He says, Christianity, if false, is of no importance. And if it's true, of infinite importance. The only thing it cannot be is moderately important. If Jesus is actually God, then that changes everything. There is no halfway if Jesus is God. We can't be lukewarm if Jesus is God. That means we have to give our entire lives for him. To work hard for him, to study hard for him, to love others as he loves. That's the call of Christianity. If the Bible isn't real, if Jesus isn't real, we can all go home. What did I give up a wife and family for? What have so many martyrs died for? What have so many saints given up and sacrificed their lives for if Jesus isn't real? But he is. He's the Christ, the Son of the living God. He's the one who even a tomb couldn't contain. He's the one that always is full of life. And he thought it was important enough that we know about him that he established a church so that 2,000 years later, once again, you and I can be in a relationship with him through the power of the Holy Spirit, which is coming to you in a particular full way at your confirmation. This is the foundation upon which the church is built. We are the children of God who need to trust the church, to trust her in what she teaches, that she's leading us on a tour of this life and is trying to point out some very important things and telling us, go here, see this, and here's why. Here's the history of this area. You'll be fascinated to know. You need to see and experience it for yourselves. So we need to trust the church in these days, but also to frequent those sacraments, especially the Eucharist and reconciliation, that we might draw near to God. Christ gave us the church to guide us, and it doesn't restrict us, right? The rules and the commandments, it doesn't restrict us, but it makes us free. Free to see what we need to see, free to be who we need to be, free to love as Jesus calls us to love. And then only in that way do we live out our vocation, because we are founded on this sturdy foundation, on the church. Keep watching, and we'll see you next time.